In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the Crusades. This was multiple military campaigns that were mounted by the Catholic Church against Middle Eastern Islamic states, and the objective was to recapture Jerusalem. It took place from 1095 to 1291 over a number of military excursions. The Crusades ultimately failed in their objective to hold on to the Holy Land, but they did leave a legacy of a deeper connection between the Middle East and Europe. The legacy of the Crusades is also very important in terms of how Muslims and Christians view one another. So hopefully after this lesson you'll understand how interreligious wars are triggered and why the Crusades remain so vivid in European and Middle Eastern memory to this day. So who were the Crusaders and why was it launched? Well, European Christians had been aware of the spread of Islam since its earliest centuries, and the fact was generally regarded by these rulers with passivity. To many rulers in Europe, the attacks were taken at the expense of the Byzantine Empire, which wasn't as much of a concern to somebody in France or Spain. It also should be noted that at this time, there wasn't really much of an idea that a military campaign had to be launched against Muslims simply because they were Muslims. One of the stereotypes about the Crusades is that it was part of the ignorance and intolerance of Europe, and it was launched in order to project that intolerance onto the Middle East. This idea has been debunked by historians largely since the 1960s, most notably by Jonathan Riley Smith at Cambridge, probably the world's foremost scholar of the Crusades. He showed that actually 20 years before the announcing of the First Crusade, the Pope put out a call for soldiers to mount an attack against Muslims in Spain. If European knights and aristocrats wanted to attack Islam, it stands to reason they would target Spain first because that was much easier to get to than the Holy Land, which they had to use an overland journey that took years and required significant wealth to launch. But not that many knights showed up to battle in Muslim Spain. However, thousands of knights answered the Pope's call in 1095 to wage a military campaign in the Middle East. So why did they answer it? Well, there's a number of reasons, which I'll get into in a second, but mostly because there was a fetishism with holy relics at this time in medieval Europe. The belief that relics, sacred items from saints, or clothing articles that belonged to Christ conferred a material blessing upon those who could take a pilgrimage to it, could view it, could pray within proximity to the object. And many Europeans took holy pilgrimages to Jerusalem. This area came under siege and certain holy sites were desecrated by the Muslim rulers. So it makes a lot more sense historically to say, due to religious zeal is why many people answered the Crusades, not so much because of an intolerance of Islam. Now, of course, there are brutal atrocities committed in the course of the Crusades that to a casual onlooker might make them ask, well, what difference does it make for the reason? The bloody result is the same. But all that to say, I wanted to set that up, first of all, just to give some context about what are the big theories about why the Crusades happened. Okay, but let's look a little bit closer at the history behind it. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuk Turks, which were a Central Asian empire whose capital was in Iran, destroyed the Byzantine Empire's army and flooded into Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. They essentially took the Anatolian land holdings from the Byzantines and some were within sight of Constantinople itself. The Seljuks almost conquered Constantinople, which then was the most magnificent Christian city on earth. It had a population of approximately 500,000, which would have positively dwarfed Paris or London, which maybe had a population of 20 or 30,000 at the time. Those cities could be dropped into Constantinople and really not be missed. Byzantine Empire Alexios I appealed to Pope Urban II to send him mercenaries to push back the advances of the Turks. Christians were also scandalized by the destruction of holy sites in Jerusalem, which had been a site of pilgrimage since the 4th century. In particular, in 1009, the Fatimid Caliph's destruction of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, which is believed to be the site where Jesus was crucified, provoked the church into action. So, in 1095, what we see happening is that Pope Urban issued a call for a religious expeditionary war to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. He proclaimed that the campaign would serve as penance for all who took part, whether knight or commoner. Additionally, some participants were told they would have the opportunity to acquire homes in Palestine, with much of Europe enduring starvation conditions. Hundreds of thousands answered the call. It should also be noted here that some historians, particularly in the 19th century, argued that most went to Jerusalem to get land. Well, most of the actual crusaders already owned land, and in order to fund a crusade, which was very expensive, they had to liquidate approximately assets to pay for 7 years. So whatever assets they would have accrued on their lands, they had to liquidate 7 years of wealth to get gold in order to pay for all the provisions, the horses, and other things to be able to do this. So the theory that this was just done in order to attain land isn't quite true. Also, one major reason why this was such a sensation is that if someone conducted a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, they received a full plenary indulgence for the remissions of their sins. That doesn't mean that if you're going to hell before you go to heaven. It meant that for a Christian in good standing, they could bypass purgatory. That's what a plenary indulgence accomplished. For the first time, though, a plenary indulgence isn't just offered for a pilgrimage, but it's offered for a military adventure and a military strike. So warfare and pilgrimage are united in one in the First Crusade. So just some facts about the First Crusade. Its armies, the First Crusades were a success, and the armies established 4 kingdoms near or along the Mediterranean coast, which you can see in the map there, including one in Jerusalem. But whatever holy objectives launched their crusades initially, the aims quickly veered off course. In 1099, the army captured Jerusalem, which was against all reasonable expectation, and something that some historians think to be one of the greatest upsets in history, because it was so unlikely that the mission would succeed. The soldiers had to travel overland. It took years to arrive there. They fought many armies. They encountered starvation conditions, yet despite all those things, still managed to successfully capture Jerusalem. However, during the course of this battle, the armies massacred 70,000 Jewish and Muslim men, women, and children in the city. In subsequent crusades, defeats followed, as when the Seljuks reconquered the town of Edessa in south-central Anatolia, which you can see as the county of Edessa in the top of the map. In 1187, the famed Ayyubid leader Saladin recaptured Jerusalem. Upon hearing the news, Pope Urban III died of a heart attack. The Fourth Crusade is where things really grow off course. By 1202, the Fourth Crusade started, which was a complete disaster for Christendom. Pope Innocent II called on Christian armies to invade the Holy Land throughout Egypt, but since many ships were needed, Venice was contracted out to ferry the troops. It was an enormously lucrative contract for Venice because they received 85,000 marks of silver, a war profiteering amount which would make Halliburton blush by comparison. In 1204, the Crusaders lost sight of their mission to fight in the Holy Land and laid siege to Constantinople. The reason they did this are very complicated, but essentially Constantinople voiced support for this Fourth Crusade, and there was a debt to Venice to pay for all the shipping. Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire promised to pay thousands of marks of silver to compensate and offer 10,000 Byzantine soldiers. This was an amount that they simply weren't able to afford to pay, and this led to an event where Latin soldiers arrived at Constantinople, demanded payment, laid siege to the city, and due to one of the emperors losing the throne, entered it and essentially took command of Constantinople. They held it for 60 years, and this caused massive devastation to the city. The Byzantine Empire was hobbled, and it would never recover, being completely conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Here below you see some pictures, which are depictions of the Fourth Crusade siege happening in Constantinople. So what happened in the final stages of the Crusades? The last Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land of Acre fell in 1291. The legacy left bitter relations between Christians and Muslims, and between Latin Catholics and Greek Orthodox in Byzantium. As a result of this, in the centuries immediately after the last Crusades, there were some Christians who preferred to be ruled by Muslims instead of other Christians that had exploited them in the past. As an example, in the 1300s, when the Turkish Ottoman Empire began conquering Eastern Orthodox Christian villages in the Balkans that were under Catholic control, there were some Orthodox Christians who said that they preferred the Sultan's turban to the cardinal's hat. Although it should be noted here that the encounters between these groups were not uniformly negative. The Crusaders brought back with them to Europe such technology as the windmill and new techniques for forging weapons. Trade and the flow of information also increased as maritime trading colonies grew in Italy, cities that would be key in the Renaissance. Also, there's an explosion of global trade and exploration at this time. With the Crusades, there was a new exposure to the Middle East, and this created new tastes for foreign goods. Traders wanted to respond to these new markets, and they ventured further afield than they ever had before. There were now trader colonies set up by Venice and Genoa that went to Constantinople, but went even further into the Black Sea and started to even penetrate through the Middle East. This is where you see a century later, by accounts of famous travelers like Marco Polo, and a lot of this new interaction between the East and the West happened as a result of the Crusades. There's also some legends ascribed to Francis of Assisi, who objected to the military aims of the Crusades, but did support the idea of recapturing the Holy Land and keeping pilgrimage routes open. He went to the court of in Egypt to appeal directly to Muslim rulers there. Some say that he brought back with him the prayer beads that Catholics use as Hail Marys, came from prayer beads from Muslims used at this time. So there are different theories about new cultural interactions that took place between these groups. Nevertheless, the legacy between the Crusades is mostly a negative one between Muslims and Christians, with the wounds still remaining unhealed to this day. Some Christians consider the Crusades as a counterattack in the face of centuries of Muslim hostilities, where they expanded through North Africa and into Spain and other traditional Christian strongholds. However, Muslims think of them as the first stage in a vast plan of exploitation of the Middle East that would culminate in European colonialism of the 1800s. This isn't quite the case because although the Crusades are an important motif in the Middle East to talk about European exploitation, really until the 19th century, they weren't thought of by Middle Eastern intellectuals all that much. This is more of a later politicization of history that takes place. The Crusades, yes, there were lots of terrible atrocities that took place, but there's really nothing unique about them in terms of warfare that takes on religious overtones. After all, in the Middle Ages, whether Christian or Muslim, almost any warfare that took place had religious overtones. Rulers would talk about fighting in the name of God, beseech his blessing, and speak as though they were fighting to accomplish his purposes. So this is by no means restricted to the Crusades, nor were the Crusades any more violent or bloody than any other type of warfare that was largely taking place in the Middle East or in Europe at this time. But all that to say, there is still a negative legacy, and it goes to show that even in the most ostensibly violent times of Middle Eastern history, we can still find positive effects like the cultural cross-pollination that we looked at, and could still result from this intercultural encounter that took place. So in the next lecture, we're going to look closer at interreligious relations, and we'll look at Muslims and their rule over Christians and Jews.